Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Mary Alvarez. I'm located here in Texas. I'm practicing right now in Austin, and I'm going to visit with everyone concerning the topic of prevention and early intervention and the push for the field as a whole to really prioritize prevention and early intervention, because by the time these cases become mired in the court system and reach the severe level of parental alienation, by and large, is too late. While children can reunite with the targeted parent, the damage done to them psychologically and developmentally has already been done. And so prevention is the gold standard, and early intervention quickly follows so that we don't further damage children, oftentimes for life. So as Elaine mentioned, I am a former custody evaluator, and so my beginnings in parental alienation really occurred as a custody evaluator because I saw the very, very worst of these families because they couldn't figure out how to solve their problems any other way except through litigation. And so that's where I have my start in this field. And then I read the research, attended PASG conferences, and then eventually presented and really became as educated as I could about the field as a whole. So what do we know currently about intervention? All right, from both a clinical perspective as well as from a research perspective. So if we look at what we do know, let's talk about it in the context of mild, moderate, and severe, because that's the way that we want to categorize alienation, to at least have some understanding of where the child is, in this process. So from that perspective, then, we essentially have little solid science concerning mild or moderate alienation. We really don't. The field has just recently moved in that direction. My colleague and I, Chris Turner, have been attacking prevention and early intervention for several years now, and I'm really pleased to see that the field now is recognizing that that's where we need to be. We need to intervene much, much sooner. So with respect to severe alienation, we actually have a better scientific understanding of severe from the perspective of the treatment, which entails a very intensive approach with a no contact order for the favored parent in order to allow the target parent and the child or children to begin the healing process. It also allows the children who have been severely alienated to start to recover some of their neurological functioning, which has been essentially hijacked as part of the alienation. So we have a much better understanding of alienation at the severe end. That's where the bulk of the research has already occurred and continues to occur. So why is prevention and early intervention so critical? Well, let's take a look at some things that are pretty sobering. The largest contributor to childhood trauma in our country, the United States, is family dysfunction. And we call that a trauma, by design. Half of children in this country who make their way into a counselor's office, a psychologist's office, are preceded by abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. And a third of adults who find their way into a clinical setting someday have a history of abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. And so overall, family dysfunction is a huge contributor to mental health, both at the child level and at the adult level. Toxic stress and developmental trauma, right? This is another reason that we need to intervene as soon as possible if we can't prevent in the first place. So what we know from DeBellis and Zisk is that these are the following consequences of toxic stress. Psychologically, on the left-hand side, they found that toxic stress increases PTSD, depression, anxiety, antisocial behavior, and a greater risk for addictions, drug and alcohol disorders, for example, and childhood traumas that are interpersonal in nature, which is the parent-child relationship, and chronic are particularly associated with these psychological and neuropsychological consequences. On the flip side, the neuropsychological consequences of childhood trauma and toxic stress are essentially across the board cognitive processing deficits and declines in memory, executive functions, IQ, and academic performance, meaning the child doesn't achieve full potential, language processing, visual spatial skills. So essentially, as I mentioned, there are so many areas of the brain collectively that are affected by toxic stress, as well as some anatomical changes that are noted by this particular study. There's a smaller prefrontal cortex, which is the area just under your forehead, and it is involved in executive processing, higher level critical thinking skills. It synthesizes information from other parts of the brain. So it's a very critical part of our brain. Less prefrontal white matter in the same area, as well as a smaller corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is a bundle of fibers that runs down the midline between our two hemispheres, the right and left hemisphere, and it helps in moving information from the right and left sides of our brain. So it helps in efficiently moving information. And if it's smaller, as it was found in this study, then that means that information moving back and forth between the left and right hemispheres is impacted. So this is what toxic stress does to the developing brain. Here's what happens psychologically to the child in high conflict divorces, some of which we would assume, so we're extrapolating here, have parental alienation. That was always my experience as a custody evaluator, those 15, 16 years that I did that. So what we find here is that 65% of children had anxiety severe enough to require counseling. A little bit more than half developed an attachment disorder. Approximately half of these children had abnormal fears and phobias. 44% became aggressive, which is an externalizing disorder. 31%, or a third of these children, had sleep disorders. So you can see the physiological effects of toxic stress in high conflict divorce situations. And then what about as adults? Previously alienated children as adults. And here's what some of the research findings have found. 70% experienced depression, compared to in our country, 8% of the general population in this country, the United States, would meet the clinical criteria for depression. Again, 70% of previously alienated children who are now adults are depressed. 65% have decreased self-worth, so that illustrates the psychological impact to the developing identity of the child. 50% are alienated from their own children. So that shows the multi-generational effect of alienation. 40% have trust issues, which illustrates that when you can't trust your parent or parents, then it's very difficult to learn to trust anybody else in life. And the other sobering statistic is 35% of previously alienated children struggle with addictions, compared to, in this country, 10% of our general population struggle with addictions. And so you can see there's some pretty profound effects, found by Amy Baker in her research earlier in the 2000s. And then a more recent study by Verhar and colleagues, 2022, found that previously alienated children who are now adults, depression and anxiety, more than half of them experienced that. 20% experience eating disorders or body image problems. 40% had personality problems and troublesome personality traits and characteristics that made life difficult for them. 10% reported psychosomatic symptoms, which has an anxiety basis. 15% admitted to self-harm behaviors such as cutting, for example, and 30% had suicidal ideation, which is horrifying to consider, that they have so much despair and distress as a result of parental alienation that they think about ending their life. 55% reported alcohol consumption starting in adolescence and peaking in their early 20s. 35% used marijuana, and 10% engaged in pornography. And so again, these are all adults who were alienated as children. So this is how Chris and I conceptualize levels of intervention, from prevention, followed by early intervention, followed by urgent intervention, followed by critical intervention. And again, this is the way that we categorize levels of intervention. So let's put that to alienation. So on the far left, under no alienation concerns, that would be preventative model, preventing that becoming a factor in a separation, divorce, or a modification to an existing divorce decree. Mild alienation requires, in our opinion, early intervention, because you want to, again, stop the trajectory or the potential trajectory from mild to moderate to severe. If the alienation is at the moderate level, urgent intervention to prevent these families from moving into severe alienation and a severely alienated child. And then we consider severe alienation as critical intervention, that it's very important to intervene swiftly and quickly. So let's look at this from slide by slide and take this apart. So no alienation. This is the prevention model. So that could happen in these kinds of situations: intact families, but some parent conflict, but there's not really any alienation yet. Intact family with a few alienation tactics, okay. Recently separated parents with minor conflict, and recently divorced parents with minor conflict. So these are the groups of people for which a prevention model is essential, because while some of them would never progress to alienation, some of them do. And so I will talk about the nuts and bolts of what to do as a preventative model, further down in my presentation. But that is prevention. So prevention components can look like parent education, and that can take any number of forms. The mental health professional can be the educator. The parents can receive parent education through the school and the school counseling system. Pediatricians can be a point of contact, because they're made aware when they see the children for medical care that there's been a change in the family. Churches, can also be instrumental in education. Divorce groups for kids is a preventative component to help them weather the effects that have changed in their families and the parent conflict in a way that doesn't make them more susceptible to alienation tactics. It's kind of an immunization approach. Divorce and family counseling, again, is a preventative model to help parents understand and children work together in ways that will promote a healthier transition. It's still a transition, but a healthier transition from the intact family to a separated family to a divorced family. So mild alienation, we consider early intervention because there's already alienation occurring. All right, so what does that look like in various groups? So you have the intact family, but there's more parental conflict in the intact family. you have the intact family with more alienation tactics. And that happens. You know, one parent already starts to align the children with him or her before the family separates and divorces, as well as recently separated and escalating conflict families, and then recently divorced but escalating conflict. So these are the families that, yes, there's a divorce, but the conflict is still brewing and is still part of the equation. The divorce does not create a way for that to cease. So what would intervention look like in mild alienation? Parent education. We have found that parent education is critical, and it absolutely has a role in all of this. And there's some caveats that I'll explain as I move along. Child counseling. All right, the child needs to get into a well-versed mental health professional who understands alienation. It's different than typical adjustment to your parents separating. When you use the Baker 17 alienation tactics as your guide in trying to understand what is or isn't happening in the family, then you use that information during child counseling. A parenting plan is very important so that parents start out of the gate with something tangible and have a way to try and work together rather than everybody figuring it out and people getting their feelings hurt and getting angry and upset, and then the alienation tactics increase as a result. And then individual parent counseling. The parents need to take care of themselves, and often parents put themselves at the bottom of the ladder as the financial resources go to attorneys and courts and or the mental health needs of the child, etc. But individual parent counseling is a way for the parent to address his or her own needs so that anger, resentment, whatever is brewing in them as a result of the demise of the marriage can be addressed and not fester into something more profound, especially parents who have some personality either disorder or certainly traits that make them a risk factor for using alienation. So moderate alienation under our model requires urgent intervention. And that can happen in an intact family with conflict and alienation tactics. It can happen in a recently separated but set of parents who have much more chronic parent conflict, and recently divorced, but again, more than at the mild level of parent conflict. So, you know, this just is amplified everything in these families. And the child is starting to resist wanting to spend time with the other parent. Although when they get over there and the other parents care, yes, they're there, but they're disruptive. Whereas a child with a mildly alienated situation settles down and does relatively well, if not fine, once they're in the care of the target parent. The moderately alienated child doesn't integrate into the target parent's family, but does go. So the urgent intervention components that we believe make sense would be, again, parent education, child counseling, more parent education than just your typical baseline concepts that parents need to learn. And so we have a two-tiered approach to our parent education model. Family work, all right, because there is a disruption in the parent-child relationship. It's not at a severe end, but the child does resist spending time with the target parent. So you need to get in there and do family work, even though the child is resistant. And then a strong judiciary approach would be ideal, with consequences for badly behaving parents. So instead of giving these favored parents lectures, judicial lectures, or threats of doing things, do something from the judiciary for badly behaving parents who interfere in communication and contact, interfere in custody, continue to denigrate, continue to present the target parent as dangerous. And then Chris and I have found that case management is critical. Because without somebody overseeing this whole process and staying intimately involved in the different levels, as a person who, just has a finger in all of the pots, the moderately alienated child, especially without any judicial teeth, is going to continue to decline. And so we have used a case management approach, and we can say that maybe we haven't reduced everything to a mild level, but we've prevented these families from escalating into severe alienation. So critical intervention is required for severe alienation, and that can happen immediately at the recently separated and high chronic conflict families, and the recently divorced, or even maybe the divorce has been several years and someone is going back to file a modification. And in order to meet the criteria to file a modification in Texas anyway, you have to show some substantial and material change in the parent-child relationship. And so creating a fear in the child of the other parent is one such way. So the critical components for severe, which we have a much better understanding of, are court changes that change custody from the favored parent to the target parent, the no contact order issued by the court between the favored parent and the children, at least 90 days seems to be the standard, an intensive reunification program for dad or mom and the children, and then reintroduction of the favored parent through a careful process that's built into the system. So those are the components that we have been operating under for quite some time now. And the research on at least a couple of these programs has been encouraging to show that they are helpful. They absolutely help the target parent and the children reunify. And the children are not afraid, to be in the presence of the target parent once the favored parent has been restricted from access. So let me focus a little bit here on the science and what I feel are important, but not an exhaustive list of research questions for mild and moderate alienation. Because if the field is going to intervene much sooner and or optimally take a prevention approach, well, we need to have science to underscore and back up what we are doing so that we're not susceptible to being called junk science. So I organized research questions into 4 categories: theoretical, judicial, clinical, and intervention research questions. So in breaking those down, theoretical questions could be such as, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, qualitative and quantitative differences between mild, moderate, and severe. What are those? Not just in number of tactics being used between mild, moderate, and severe, which is very helpful to know. Right now, it's kind of some alienation tactics at mild, more alienation tactics at moderate, and a lot of alienation tactics at severe. But we don't know why some children can endure more over a longer period of time, whereas some children are susceptible to alienation tactics immediately. So we need to identify and understand parental alienation from that perspective, as well as in intact families. What is starting? What is brewing in the intact family? We have some preliminary, information, but we need to understand it in more detail. We would assume, but we have to prove up with research that obviously one of the parents would have a personality disorder that we find at the severe end. Well, they don't just develop a personality disorder as a result of a separation or a divorce. They've had that, and it's been expressing itself in the family. Followed by, how are parents that alienate different from parents who divorce but don't alienate, besides personality disorders? All right, what else, is there that can help us predict which families are at highest risk for parental alienation. So these are just, like I said, 3 various theoretical questions, but there's many more, but these would be important starting points. So what are some judicial related questions that research could help us understand? How much and in what ways does the judicial process affect parental alienation? Anecdotally, if you work in the family law system as I do, you can say anecdotally that the judicial system affects it greatly because it's in our country, it's an adversarial process. It pits 2 parents against each other. In order to win your case, you have to be brutal towards the other parent, and you have to find absolutely everything wrong with that other parent in order to convince the court that you are the better choice. A second question could be, what is the effect on parent behaviors if the judiciary uses a diversion program? And again, that's something that my colleague and I have started implementing. We wrote a diversion program and then COVID hijacked it, but we're now coming out of COVID enough that we're going to review and reevaluate our diversion program and find some courts that are willing to take this approach. So it's just like on the criminal side. Instead of using the judiciary to decrease criminal behavior, can we use a diversion approach to decrease criminal behavior, keep them out of the court system in the first place? And then what is the effect of judiciary consequences on parent behavior? That for me is key. And judges are hesitant to implement consequences due to several factors. It just seems very dicey to punish a parent and throw them in jail for a few days or give them a monetary fine or both. But when the judiciary understands the deleterious effects of parental alienation on children, and then again, as when they're adults, the tremendous risk factors that they have psychologically there, it's easier for them. So it all comes back to education of the professionals who interact with these families. Here are some clinical questions that make sense to me. Identify and understand the psychopathology, depression, anxiety, factitious disorder, parental trauma as a child themselves associated with parental alienation in children and parents. It's just to better understand from a psychological perspective so that we have better predictive factors as to which families and which parents are at highest risk. Which psychopathology and personality characteristics predict which level of parental alienation? So does a borderline always escalate to severe alienating tactics if left unchecked? I don't know. What is the level of psychological splitting in mild to moderately alienated children, and how does that compare to severely alienated children? And my colleague Chris Turner and I are actually investigating this. We are collecting data in the park for mild and moderate, and we'll then be able to offer the other end of the continuum from severe, which Bill Burnett has already conducted some very good research, solid research related to severe children and splitting. And then what are the cortisol levels in children and parents in which alienation is a factor? What's going on neurologically in that toxic stress response as related to the brain in parents and children. So intervention questions that make sense to me would be define and measure program efficacy of existing programs for parental alienation, including our own, the ones that Chris and I do. What are the best educational or clinical approaches for treating mild, moderate, and severe levels of parental alienation? So just refining what we think needs to go into the equation, we need to define and then study the efficacy of those approaches. Which combinations of treatment approaches show the best outcome for mild, moderate, and severe? So just an overall good understanding of the efficacy of what we're promoting, We need the solid science behind it. And so it really requires clinicians, such as me, to pair with the professors at universities. So the professors have the research background and the graduate students, but they need the subjects, so as clinicians, we have the subjects, the families and the children, and that's a great marriage in a way to promote the science and research. So the path forward, this is what I want to spend some time discussing as the last part of my presentation. So the path forward models likely should look something like this. You have an educational component that is critical, and that means educating the following groups of professionals: school personnel, school teachers, principals, and school counselors are on the front lines. They see these children every day. School teachers, classroom teachers, are particularly important because they see the children on such a frequent, regular basis that they can detect changes in the child. And also, children tend to write about, as part of their classroom assignments, what's going on at home. And so these teachers being trained in what to look for that might suggest something more than just a transitional issue or an adjustment issue to a change in the family is critical. Physicians. Parents take their children to physicians, and physicians again are in a position to have an outside look into the internal workings of the child. If a parent is taking a child to the pediatrician because the child appears to be depressed and anxious, well, pediatricians having knowledge about family systems and what separation and divorce can be in certain families would be tremendously helpful. So it's not just garden variety depression or anxiety related to a tough school schedule or being bullied. I mean, they need to examine those as well, but also look at what's the home environment. And that's not as comfortable discussion for pediatricians or family physicians, but we need to educate them on how to do that. Of course, the judiciary, and we spend a lot of time educating the judiciary on parental alienation and the role of the judiciary and what happens when these cases are languishing and lingering in court year after year. Sometimes, what are the serious risk factors that judges need to understand and try and prevent through more expeditiously moving these court cases through the court system. Child protection agencies. We also train child protection agencies. They're overworked, understaffed. I mean, they are literally, in a very critical part of helping keep children safe. But emotional abuse, of which parental alienation, especially at the severe end, is considered, is very difficult to define and intangible in a lot of ways. So helping CPS or child protection agencies understand that you can look for specific behaviors. You can look for the alienation tactics. You can look for the 8 behavioral manifestations from the children. And it doesn't have to be so intangible. You can actually define these things from a behavioral perspective. Is the child, making just ridiculous complaints about the parent? I mean, that's pretty tangible with examples that can either prove or disprove that particular concern. Attorneys, similar to judges, we train attorneys on a regular basis. They are also on the front lines. They're the ones that are filing for divorce, filing for modifications, and it's difficult for the attorneys because they were trained in an adversarial approach, and we're helping them understand that that may have a role in certain situations, but in situations of alienation or these very high at-risk families, the adversarial approach just contributes to the demise of the family. So families come into the system somewhat broken, and by the time all is said and done, they are shattered, and the children pay the price, as does the target parent. He loses a relationship with the child. And then mental health professionals. We also train mental health professionals because these are the families that they are seeing in their practice. And over and over again, the feedback we have from mental health professionals is, I can name 8 families right now that are engaging in, one parent is engaging in parental alienation. I just never knew really what it was, or how bad it can be, and or how bad it can get. And so mental health professionals are very receptive to understanding, this particular dynamic in certain families. They shy away from, for the most part, interacting with the legal system, but that's okay. They don't have to do that. There's other of us who are willing to do that. So education is a critical component of prevention and early intervention of other professionals. All right, research-supported referral sources. So we need to understand, as we promote prevention programs, ours included, does research support that approach? So when professionals, the pediatrician, the school teacher, another mental health professional who doesn't specialize in this area, when they need a referral, they feel confident that the referral is based on some science and research. Now, of course, that takes time, but we have to start somewhere. Early intervention programs, same thing. We need research that shows the efficacy of early intervention programs, whatever the components are. It's just starting to refine what works and what doesn't work. Swift judicial action, as I mentioned earlier, that needs to be set into a research design and investigated scientifically, empirically, so that, especially in a judicial system that relies on evidence, we've got evidence that shows that these components work in prevention programs and early intervention programs. And then case management oversight, investigating the role of case management. We have found it to be critical, especially with moderate families, because it's time intensive, but it keeps the favored parent from behaving unfettered and just having no obstacles and no repercussions for their behavior. So we can at least say that we succeed in that way with a case management approach. And then, of course, research. I've just, throughout this entire presentation, we just need now the solid research findings to begin to put together our prevention and early intervention models, and therefore offset the graduation of some families into severe alienation, which by that time there's just much damage to the child, unfortunately. So, I've been mentioning that, Chris and I, my colleague, have put together several things, and we're going to share that with you, not to promote what we're doing, but to give you a sense in your own jurisdiction, in your own country, of kind of a structure that you can begin to use or modify it so that you can use it in your own way, but still underscoring that we need research to back all of this up and to understand the efficacy of anything that we're doing. So our Resetting the Family, we start with an evaluation, and then we have 2 different levels of educational classes. The beginning kind of entry level prerequisite class that really talks about a lot of the things that I've presented here, but in much more detail, about the effect on the child psychologically, the toxic stress response. And then we have a more intensive parent education program. We do the family work, to repair relationships and provide some protective factors for relationships. And then our case management, our total oversight piece to all of this that keeps the progress moving forward, even if it's slowly. At least we're moving forward, and we're not allowing the family to, once everybody steps out of the intervention, to regress, to what's familiar or uncomfortable, especially if there's an ongoing court case that hasn't resolved. So our 101 is our 2-hour intensive program. I just think that regardless of whatever you put together, there needs to be an introduction into the key components that parents need to be aware of. And in our experience with our parents, they are, especially the target parents, are shocked at a lot of what they find can happen to children. And much of what we present is already based in the science. At least we've got, toxic stress and the developmental and neurological effects on children thereof. So the favored parent is dicier, and so you have to work harder with a favored parent because it's for a variety of factors, that we still need to understand through the research, but some of them personality features. They don't want to look at it this way, and they have a very difficult time with any self-awareness. And so we work on self-awareness. So our perspective is always through the child's eyes. It's always helping parents understand through the child's eyes, through the child's perspective, what it's like. And we talk, like I said, in detail about, much more detail than I presented here, about toxic stress and high conflict families. We talk about the ACEs. We introduce them to adverse childhood experiences and take them through, many of the ACEs, some of which are considered divorce, separation, divorce, and high conflict families. And then we like to help our parents learn some basic tools, that they can start engaging in right now that don't require 12 weeks, of work and education, just some basic things that they can do and leave that day and implement, such as being civil to the other parent in front of the child. For example, just being civil can make a huge difference to a child, who has anxiety about how their parents interact with each other, especially in public. All right, we see those kids, their anxiety elevates significantly, thinking that their parents are going to misbehave. And of course, it's embarrassing, etc. So some of the topics that we have found helpful, in a early intervention model and prevention, the role of both parents. What happens in high conflict adversarial legal proceedings is you have to devalue somebody in order to promote yourself to the court in a way that the court feels that the children their best interest would be served better with you than the other parent. So you have to not only understand the role of both parents, male and female, mothers and fathers have unique contributions to children. And you can't ignore that. It's essentially hardwired. And so when you try and erase one parent, which is what happens with alienation, you are then going against the grain of biology. And so valuing the other parent as a parent is a concept that we work on. We work on self-care with these parents because taking care of themselves, especially the target parent, is essential in being able to weather, sometimes a very long process. Communication skills are very, very important for these parents. A lot of times they're communicating through Our Family Wizard or some other app where it's, all in written form, emails, text messaging, things like that, which isn't necessarily bad, but you have to be effective at it. If you're calling people names, even in written form, that's not going to be effective. And then conflict resolution. We find that these parents have very, very low levels of conflict resolution solutions. And generally, again, that would start in the intact family. And it just is exacerbated, and more pronounced once the parties separate, because then it's harder for a parent to, the overbearing dominant parent, to control, the other parent like they did when they were in the intact family. Okay, so family work is important to help repair the parent-child relationship. And what's key in this process, which is counterintuitive to clinicians who don't specialize in this area, and also is contradictory to a lot of training models, is including the favored parent in the process. So it's not just a matter of target parent and child reconnecting. If the favored parent is not brought into the system, then they're just behind the scenes continuing the alienating behavior. And so you have to work with them, and putting both parents and the child in the same room can be very powerful, because you're there to control and structure everything so that nothing goes terribly awry, or you can shut it down. But it gives the message to the child that both parents have value, and especially when you have the favored parent sitting in the room with the target parent that they have spent the last 3 years denigrating to the child. It's a powerful message. So clinicians, again, this is contradictory to them and counterintuitive to them. And so it's eye-opening when we educate them about that particular feature. And then case management. We see case management as the person who is like the point guard in a basketball game, just always going between professionals, communicating, for example, with the mental health professionals that maybe the children see, or maybe the parents see, communicating with the judiciary, including attorneys, communicating with an amicus or a guardian ad litem attorney for the child, teachers, gathering information from teachers because they see the child on a daily basis, pediatricians, other family members. I mean, just whoever needs to contribute to the knowledge base of the case manager, so the case manager can offset and prevent some things from really going awry. And we have found, again, anecdotally, that our case management approach is very, very helpful in preventing some of the deterioration. And then making recommendations along the way to tweak, the system as we're doing it. So it's that person with much oversight, that is critical to helping these families and these children not only learn, but heal. So I like to conclude with just a thought, to provoke some thinking. The way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. And we're all familiar with Walt Disney, but taking whatever we know right now in parental alienation, being committed to a scientific approach wherever possible, and getting started somehow, some way in prevention and early intervention to offset the likelihood that the parental alienation will digress into moderate alienation, and then the horrific severe alienation, that we have all either experienced, if you're a parent out there, or grandparent, or a professional in some capacity. So we encourage everybody to jump on board, and let's make prevention and early intervention our new mantra. So I appreciate being able to speak to everyone and share what my colleague and I are doing here in the States. And thank you very much.